Well, I thought I would start with the general social and religious background of Monroe County around, say, 1820, something like that. That was the era of what was called the last Great Awakening. And the most characteristic form of religious activity around here in, say, 1820, 1825, 1830, was the camp meeting. Now, the camp meetings have their origin, I would argue, primarily in what I would call geography. The Christian tradition of going to church on Sunday is very, very old, and fairly suddenly, when the frontier opened up, for many people it became impossible. Say you grew up in a fairly large town. Going to church on Sunday would probably be a matter of walking a block or two at most. That did not happen, could not happen, in Monroe County to most of the people in the 1820s. If, for example, you lived somewhere between Madisonville and Sweetwater, it might be 5 or 6 miles to the nearest church. And in 5 or 6 miles in those days was a long way, partly because there were really no roads. What we might call a road was simply a path in the woods that had been cleared enough so that wagons or buggies might make it if they were lucky. If you weren't lucky, well, you were stuck. If you had a fairly large family, and large families were common in those days, say you had a half dozen kids and you only had 1 or 2 horses, you're just not going to make it to church on time. Even if you get up early, it could be 5, 6 miles to the nearest church. Well, the solution to this was the camp meeting. Instead of going to church every Sunday for a year, a great many people would go to church, so to speak, for a couple of weeks every summer, and that was it. Large tracts of land were selected, more or less flat, and the area where Hiwassee College would be built was donated by a Methodist minister, and if you are driving past what used to be Hiwassee College, on the right you go over a little bridge and you'll see a fairly flat, small piece of land with no brush on it. That was called Ebenezer Campground. And on the other side of the road, you will see what is now a baseball field. A small log chapel was built there named Keyes Chapel in honor of John Ross Keyes. Well, every summer, usually about June into July, there came a pause in agricultural activities. People would go through the fields with a hoe and chop down all the weeds, and they really didn't need to do anything for a while. We know that by the later 1820s, there was what was called a shelter at Bat Creek Campground. This was a long building built out of logs. It was roofed with wooden shingles, and it kind of looked like a storage unit without any doors. You could rent one of these little places, sort of a walk-in apartment, so to speak, and you and your family could spend the nights there, and a camp meeting might go for a whole week, usually a whole week sometimes. If there was a big crowd, if there were attractive evangelists, it might go for 2 weeks. There would be a shed built of logs with leafy boughs on top of it to furnish a roof. That was mainly to keep the sun out. And that would be on that flat side, on that flat piece of ground on the right-hand side in front of what used to be Hiwassee College. We know quite a bit about who was preaching there. John Ross Key was the local preacher. He would preach generally every Sunday at Key's Chapel, and that was no big deal. The people in the neighborhood could walk there or ride a horse and get there every Sunday. But the big tent meeting campground services were very different. We know that one of the most famous Methodist preachers, evangelists, campground preachers, would occasionally visit. He had settled in Sweetwater, and he would come up, ride a horse 8 miles, and would assist at the annual revivals. We have some interesting statistics. The circuit, Methodist churches were separated into what was called circuits. There would be a circuit town. The town would be the name of the circuit. And in this case, it would have been Madisonville. Well, in 1820, it was called Tellico. But there would be a circuit riding preacher stationed in Madisonville, living usually with his family at a parsonage next door to the church. And on a regular schedule, he would ride around a series of small churches. And Bat Creek was one of the stops. And Chestua, out on 411, about 4 miles out of town. It's a little brick church, and it's been there since the 1820s. Not that building, but the institution has been there since the 1820s. The most famous minister known to have preached at Bat Creek was the Reverend James Axley, A-X-L-E-Y. He started his career in the last decade of the 1700s in Kentucky. And he retired in 1822 and bought a little farm, got married, and raised a family at Sweetwater. He was a friend of John Ross Key's, and whenever there was a revival at Bat Creek, he would ride in and conduct the services. He was an extremely charismatic preacher, rather, I would say, eccentric. He had no formal education. He could read and write, but that was it. But he was very frank and very direct spoken. And he had a famous sermon that he would preach over and over again. It was called the Sermon of the Abominations. He would preach about things which were, he believed, absolutely hateful to God. That's what abomination means. The prime abomination, he would say, is slavery. He was very proud of the fact that he had a good farm down near Sweetwater, and he said, "No slave has ever set foot on my farm," which refers, of course, to the practice in those days of renting out slaves. If you need some workers for a few weeks, you could rent some. He refused to even do that. That was the first abomination. The second abomination was the use of tobacco. He would call out people in the congregation, men who were sitting there chewing tobaccos and spitting on the ground. He would say that's a wicked thing to do. The next abomination was alcohol. He once threw a distiller of hard spirits out of his congregation because it was wicked. He didn't have anything particular against wine, but hard spirits like whiskey and rum and so forth was yet another abomination. And finally, his last abomination was women wearing modern clothes, which were obviously intended to be sexually appealing. He even went so far as to denounce young men who came to his meeting wearing silk top hats. You know, the stovepipe hat like Lincoln wore. That was yet another abomination. And we can be quite sure that he preached there at Bat Creek. David Key, in a little memoir that he wrote about a year before he died, tells us the story of when Father Axley, as they called it, showed up to preach at Bat Creek. The story goes that this was midsummer and they were having a terrible drought. It hadn't rained in months. Well, the congregation begged Father Axley to pray for rain. Well, the old man knelt down and very loudly before the whole congregation besought the Almighty to give us rain, rain. We need rain so badly. Well, he had hardly more than stood up and was walking toward where he tied his horses, and it started raining. Not only did it start raining, it came a flood. In fact, one of the men from the congregation jumped on his horse and rode as fast as he could and caught up with Father Axley and begged him to come back to the pulpit and pray for a stop to the rain, which he did, and of course the rain stopped. Well, I think I will dry up at that one.